That rare dial you're paying a 50% premium for, it's not rare. In many cases, it's just damaged. Today we're pulling back the curtain. I'm going to show you the difference between true Rolex rarity and the marketing myths dealers use to sell you watches with factory defects. If you appreciate the truth about luxury, subscribe to Opulent Oasis, like this video, and hit the notification bell. Let's get into it. In the world of high-end watches, the word rare is the most powerful and the most misused marketing tool there is. For a brand like Rolex built on mass production at an incredible scale, true rarity is the exception, not the rule. To see the lie, you first have to understand the truth. There are two gold standard benchmarks for real scarcity. The first benchmark is rarity by design. This is scarcity that is baked in from the start. It comes from materials that are difficult or almost impossible to work with, or from incredibly complex manufacturing processes. A perfect example is a meteorite dial. Rolex meteorite dials are sourced from slices of the Gibeon meteorite. They feature a unique crystal pattern called a Widmanstätten pattern. That's the metallic lattice you see. It's formed over millions of years as an asteroid cools in space. You cannot fake it, and no two dials are ever identical. That is real, inherent rarity. The same goes for hard stone dials. Think of Lapis Lazuli, Malachite, or the deep pure black of onyx. To make one, Rolex has to cut a paper-thin slice from a block of stone. The process has an exceptionally high failure rate. The slightest fissure, the tiniest imperfection, and the dial shatters. This naturally limits production. Some of these dials were further restricted, like Tiger Eye, which only appeared in yellow gold day-date and date-just models. Some, like Bloodstone, are exceptionally rare. Only a couple of examples are known to exist in white gold day-date models. Even a complex manufacturing process can create rarity. In the 1970s and 80s, Rolex offered vibrant, colorful enamel dials called Stella dials. They came in bright, opaque colors like oxblood, pink, green, and orange. They were named after Stella, the Geneva-based company that supplied the specialized lacquer. The creation process was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring multiple layers of lacquer to be meticulously spray-painted and baked to achieve the desired depth. Ironically, when they were new, nobody wanted them. They were seen as too bold for a conservative brand. Because demand was so low, many of these dials were replaced during servicing or reportedly destroyed. Their original unpopularity is what makes the few surviving examples so rare and sought after today. The second benchmark for true rarity is rarity by commission. This is when you have a documented, verifiable limited edition. These are watches that were never for sale to the public. The most legendary examples are the COMEX dials. Beginning in the 1970s, Rolex supplied specially marked Submariner and Sea Dweller models to COMEX, a pioneering French commercial diving company. These were not consumer products, they were professional instruments designed for the world's most extreme underwater environments. Their rarity isn't speculation, it is quantifiable fact. For example, across 2 decades of partnership, the total production of all COMEX Sea Dweller references is estimated at a mere 700 units. These watches are confirmed by the prominent COMEX logo on the dial and a specific issue number engraved on the caseback. That is quantifiable rarity. Another prime example is the Khanjar dial. These were commissioned by the Sultan of Oman starting in the 70s to be given as gifts. These watches were distinguished by the Khanjar, the national emblem of Oman, which is a dagger and 2 crossed swords. The Sultan's influence was so great that in some cases Rolex would supply specially prepared dials with its own standard text removed to make space for the emblem. Think about that. Rolex, a brand fiercely protective of its branding, wiping its own name off the dial to accommodate a client. That's how exclusive and limited these commissions were. So meteorite, stone, Stella, COMEX, Khanjar. In all these cases, the scarcity is intentional, it's verifiable, and it's rooted in a specific limited context. Now let's compare that gold standard to the defect dials. This is where the marketing narrative takes over. We're talking about the famous tropical, spider, and Patritzy dials. These are often marketed as romantic, one-of-a-kind artifacts. The truth? They are unintentional manufacturing flaws. Their scarcity is more a product of marketing narrative than statistical fact. Let's start with the most famous of all, the tropical dial. The myth is compelling. The story is that these watches lived a life of adventure, their once black dials tanned to a unique chocolate-brown hue under the Caribbean sun. Auction houses and dealers describe them with evocative language, calling them one of a kind and noting that they consistently trade for significant premiums over their standard counterparts. The scientific reality, however, is far more mundane. The tropical effect is the result of a manufacturing defect. Between the 1950s and early 70s, a protective anti-UV coating applied to dials by a Rolex subcontractor proved to be unstable. Instead of protecting the dial, an inadequate dosage or flawed chemical composition caused it to react with sunlight, heat, and humidity, leading to discoloration over several decades. It was an unintentional production error that Rolex later corrected. In fact, some analysis even suggests that the tropical sun story is a myth, and that the browning is simply a result of the chemical breakdown of pigments within the black paint, a process that can occur even if a watch is stored in a safe. But here is the central flaw in the rare argument. It's what the research calls the pool of potential fallacy. This defective coating was used across numerous Rolex sports models for a period of approximately 2 decades. To assess the true prevalence, you have to consider the production volume. Let's take just one prime example, the popular Submariner model produced from 1962 to 1989. That is an astonishing 27-year production run that almost perfectly overlaps with the era of the faulty dial coating. With production estimates for just that one model alone exceeding 150,000 units, the potential pool of watches that could develop this flaw is enormous. Other popular models from the era, like the GMT Master, also had long, high-volume production runs. While it is true that only a fraction of these dials, perhaps less than 10%, actually turned tropical, 10% of a very large number is still a very large number. The phenomenon of discoloration across this vast population of watches is therefore not statistically rare. The narrative of rarity is built on survivorship bias. It focuses only on the relatively smaller number of examples that have survived with an aesthetically pleasing, uniform patina. But a critical distinction must be made between genuine patina and simple damage. A true tropical dial should exhibit a relatively even color change on a dial surface that remains glossy and intact. The market, however, is flooded with watches marketed as tropical that are, in reality, just damaged. These dials often show signs of moisture ingress, such as cracked or peeling lacquer, corroded hands, and stained luminous material. One expert bluntly refers to this as the shitage effect, a common and effectively worthless form of damage that is often dishonestly conflated with a desirable patina. Next, let's talk about the spider dial. If the tropical dial's rarity is questionable, the scarcity of the spider dial is a myth built on even shakier ground. The narrative presents these dials, which feature a fine network of cracks in their glossy surface, as a rare and beautiful quirk that adds a unique fingerprint to a watch. This web-like pattern, or crazing, is framed as a desirable form of natural aging. The reality is that the spider dial is a widespread and well-documented production flaw. During the 1980s, Rolex began transitioning its sports watch lines from matte dials to more modern, glossy dials. The lacquer mixture used for these early gloss dials proved to be unstable. Over time, exposure to UV light and temperature fluctuations caused the lacquer to shrink and develop micro cracks, creating the signature spider web effect. This was not an isolated incident. It was a systemic issue that plagued a wide range of popular transitional models from that era, including the Submariner and the GMT Master. Given the popularity of these models, the number of watches produced with this flawed lacquer is substantial, making the spider effect far from rare. The collector community's sentiment on spider dials further undermines the narrative. Unlike tropical dials, spider dials are highly polarizing. Many seasoned collectors view the crazing not as patina, but as simple damage, a defect that compromises the integrity of the dial. Skeptics argue that the term spider dial was invented by dealers as a marketing ploy to sell watches with defective dials that would otherwise be difficult to move. There is a tangible risk that the cracked lacquer could eventually flake off, potentially falling into the movement and causing damage. This divided opinion is reflected in the market value. The price premium for a spider dial is significantly lower than for a tropical dial, and in many cases, it is non-existent. Some buyers may even demand a discount for what they perceive as a damaged component. Finally, there's the Patritzy dial. This one represents a more nuanced case. It is marketed with a compelling origin story, a rare and quickly corrected mistake found in a mere handful of examples. The narrative is bolstered by its specific discovery and naming by the esteemed auctioneer Osvaldo Patritzy. The effect is exclusive to the black-dialed Rolex Cosmograph Daytona produced between approximately 1994 and 1995. During this period, Rolex used an organic transparent varnish that proved inadequate. It failed to shield the silver outer tracks of the chronograph subdials from oxidation. Over time, this caused the rings to change color, developing a distinctive brown patina. Here again, the numbers tell a different story than the marketing. The Zenith Daytona was in production for 12 years and was one of the most sought-after watches in the world. While the Patritzy flaw is confined to a relatively narrow 2-year window, this window occurred during the production of an incredibly popular, high-volume model. To suggest that only a handful of examples were affected is a deliberate exaggeration. The actual number of watches produced with this defect is almost certainly in the thousands, not the dozens. While more limited in scope than the tropical or spider phenomena, the Patritzy dial is not rare on the same level as a COMEX commission. Its value is propped up by the immense popularity of the Daytona model and its compelling origin story. However, prospective buyers should exercise caution. The high values have led to a market rife with forgeries, where unscrupulous sellers have artificially aged standard dials by cooking them in ovens to simulate natural oxidation. Authenticating a genuine Patritzy dial requires significant expertise. As always, this information is for educational purposes and not financial advice. So if these defect dials aren't statistically rare, why are they perceived as scarce and valuable? The perception of rarity is not natural. It is actively created and sustained by the very ecosystem that surrounds the Rolex brand in two key ways. The first and most important is the Rolex Service Center, which has been conducting what the research calls the great culling of originality. The single greatest contributor to the scarcity of original vintage Rolex dials is, paradoxically, Rolex itself. The company's official service policy is uncompromisingly focused on perfection and precision. According to Rolex, during a service, any component that no longer meets their functional and aesthetic specifications is replaced with genuine Rolex parts. This policy aims to return a watch to its as-new factory condition with no regard for the preservation of vintage character or patina. In the eyes of the manufacturer, a faded tropical dial, a cracked spider dial, or an oxidized Patritzy dial is simply a damaged good to be discarded. And here is the critical element of this policy: the no-return rule. When Rolex deems an original part, such as a dial, to be defective, it is replaced with a modern service dial. The original component is then retained by Rolex and is not returned to the owner. For decades, this policy has acted as a great culling, systematically removing these now valuable dials from the global pool of watches. Every unsuspecting owner who sent their aging Submariner in for a routine service may have inadvertently contributed to the rarity of the very features that make their watch collectible today. This creates a profound paradox. Rolex's institutional obsession with erasing imperfections is the primary engine that manufactures the scarcity of those same imperfections. The rarity is not entirely natural. It is an artificial scarcity actively created by corporate procedure. This practice forces a difficult dilemma upon owners: service a watch through Rolex and risk losing a valuable original dial, or use an independent watchmaker who may be restricted from accessing an official supply of genuine Rolex parts. The second mechanism driving the value of these dials is the cultural and psychological power of the Rolex brand itself. This raises a fundamental question. Why is a cracked lacquer dial on a Rolex a spider dial that can command a premium, while the exact same flaw on a less prestigious vintage watch is simply considered damage that detracts from its value? And the answer lies in the power of narrative, which is built upon the foundation of brand prestige. Because Rolex is universally regarded as a paragon of quality and perfection, any deviation from this standard becomes an anomaly, an event worthy of a story. A flaw in a product designed to be flawless is inherently more interesting than a flaw in an ordinary product. This brand power gives dealers, auction houses, and collectors a credible platform from which to build compelling narratives around these mistakes. This has led to a highly subjective line being drawn between patina and damage. As one collector astutely observed, "It's patina if I like it. It's damage if I don't." The very language used in the vintage market is a deliberate marketing strategy. Terms like tropical, ghost bezel, and spider dial are not technical descriptors. They are marketing inventions created to evoke a sense of history, adventure, and uniqueness. Auction house descriptions are filled with carefully chosen adjectives, charming, honest, warm patina, to transform a chemical breakdown into a desirable attribute. Ultimately, the value of these dials is not an intrinsic property of their physical state. It is a value that is culturally constructed by the collective agreement of the watch community. A cracked dial is just a cracked dial. But when it appears on a Rolex, it is imbued with a story, a nickname, and a price tag that would be nonsensical for any lesser brand. The value is not in the flaw itself, but in the crown logo that sits just above it. So let's recap the truth. True Rolex rarity is intentional and verifiable. Think of exotic materials like meteorite or documented limited commissions like those for COMEX. The most celebrated rare dials, Tropical Spider and Patritzy, are not rare at all. Their perceived scarcity is an illusion, masterfully constructed and sustained by a confluence of factors. The central argument against their rarity is the pool of potential fallacy. These flaws originated from widespread manufacturing issues that affected high-volume popular models produced over many years. The Submariner, with its massive production run, provided a huge pool of watches susceptible to the tropical defect. The Spider dial was a systemic lacquer issue across a whole generation of sports models. Even the Patritzy dial appeared on the massively popular Daytona, making it a near certainty that thousands, not a handful, of these watches exist. This illusion of scarcity is then actively amplified by the great culling carried out by Rolex's own service centers. The corporate policy of replacing and discarding imperfect original dials has systematically reduced their numbers, creating an artificial scarcity that Rolex itself is responsible for. Finally, the value of these dials is cemented by the power of the Rolex brand and the marketing language of the collector community, which rebrands damage as patina. For the modern collector, the takeaway is not to dismiss these watches, but to approach them with a critical and informed perspective. One can appreciate the unique aesthetic of a chocolate brown tropical dial for what it is, a fascinating artifact of manufacturing history. However, it is crucial to distinguish this aesthetic appeal from true verifiable rarity. A collector should question the narrative, analyze the production context, and understand the difference between a genuinely scarce item and a common flaw that has been brilliantly marketed as a collectible feature. The story of a rare Rolex dial is often more carefully manufactured than the watch itself. So now I want to hear from you. Knowing the difference, which do you find more desirable? A verifiably rare dial like a COMEX or a defect dial with a unique look like a tropical? Let me know in the comments.